I rehearsed the sentence until it stopped sounding like mine. It sat behind my teeth like a foreign object, sharp at the edges, refusing to dissolve. Every time I tried to swallow it, it rose again, pressing forward, demanding air. I could feel it in the smallest movements. The way my jaw tightened when someone spoke too confidently. The way my tongue held back when an assumption was repeated like a fact. I learned to keep my mouth relaxed so no one would notice the effort it took to stay silent. There were moments when silence felt like discipline, clean, professional, a kind of loyalty you could measure by how little you disrupted the room. You watched, you listened, you kept your hands still. You did not inject doubt into a space that was built to run on certainty. You did not introduce a question that might slow the machinery down. But this was different. This wasn't a harmless detail, a minor correction, an unnecessary worry. It was a shape I could already see in my mind, like a shadow cast before the object arrives. I could sense the direction things were moving, the way a decision can become a corridor with only one end, and I could feel, with a clarity that made me nauseous, that my own voice might have changed the angle of it, if I had used it at the right time. The worst part was that nothing in the room looked wrong. Faces were composed. Pens moved. Hands pointed, tapped, measured. Words were exchanged with a careful calm, as if the future was something you could schedule. The confidence was contagious. It made my doubt feel like a personal weakness, a private defect I should be ashamed of. The more certain everyone became, the more I questioned the legitimacy of my fear. I told myself it was not my place. That place mattered here more than truth. Place determined which thoughts were safe to speak and which were considered noise. There were rules that lived underneath the spoken rules, and everyone understood them without needing to explain. You could feel them in the way people paused before choosing a word, in the way they glanced toward the same figure before continuing, as if language itself required permission. I had seen what happened to people who disturbed the flow. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no spectacle, just the subtle closing of doors, a chair no longer offered, a name not included, a future quietly redirected. They didn't punish you loudly. They simply removed you from the parts of the world where decisions were made, and they did it with the same calm they used for everything else. I was not brave enough to pretend that didn't matter to me, and still, I kept hearing it, the warning, arranged in different forms, as if I could find a version that would slip through unnoticed. A softer phrasing, a cautious question, a suggestion disguised as curiosity, something that wouldn't sound like accusation, wouldn't imply anyone was wrong, wouldn't stain the room with uncertainty. I tried to build a sentence that could survive the hierarchy, but the warning, no matter how I dressed it, remained what it was, a contradiction. My body betrayed me in small ways, a pulse that wouldn't settle, a coldness in my fingertips, the sensation that my skin had become too tight for my bones. I remember staring at the corner of a table and thinking, absurdly, that if I spoke, the table would remember, that the room itself would record my disobedience in its silence afterward, that there would be a pause, brief, controlled, surgical, and in that pause I would become visible in the worst way. It wasn't the fear of being wrong that stopped me. I could live with embarrassment. I could live with a correction. It was the fear of being seen as someone who hesitated when hesitation was treated like infection. Someone who introduced doubt when doubt was considered a threat. Someone who, by speaking, suggested that the structure might not be enough. I watched my own hands as if they belonged to someone else. I kept them folded. I kept my face neutral. I waited for a natural opening that never came. I waited for someone else to notice what I noticed, to raise it first, to take the risk so I wouldn't have to. The opening came and went in forms I didn't recognize until too late. A brief question asked in passing, a pause that could have held my voice, a moment when the room exhaled, when a single word from me might have entered without sounding like challenge. Each time I stayed still, and with every second that passed, the warning became heavier, not because it changed, but because the act of withholding it began to define me. It turned into something I was actively doing, not merely failing to do. It became a decision I was making repeatedly, minute by minute, while telling myself I hadn't decided anything at all. In the end, I didn't even feel relief when I let it go. I felt a quiet, sickening clarity. I heard my own silence settle into place, and I understood that it was already chosen. The days had a rhythm that made questions feel unnecessary. Everything moved according to routines refined long before I arrived. Wake, assemble, listen, record, repeat. The structure was comforting in its precision. It told you where to stand, when to speak, and, more importantly, when not to. Authority was not enforced through volume or spectacle. It existed in posture, in the way certain voices never needed to repeat themselves, in the way others learned to lower their eyes at the right moments. I was close enough to hear things before they were finalized, close enough to recognize when certainty was being constructed rather than discovered. That proximity carried a quiet burden. You were expected to absorb information without reshaping it, to notice without interpreting too loudly. Understanding was encouraged. Interpretation was not. No one ever said this directly. No rule book spelled it out. But it was understood in the same way gravity is understood. You learned it by watching who spoke freely and who chose their words as if stepping across thin ice. You learned it by noticing which remarks were acknowledged and which were allowed to evaporate without response. Over time, you stopped needing reminders. The environment rewarded smoothness. Anything that disrupted momentum was treated as inefficiency, a delay, a complication. Doubt was tolerated only when it arrived from the correct direction, carried by the correct voice. When it came from anywhere else, it felt like static, something to be filtered out so the signal could remain clean. I was not new. I had been there long enough to recognize patterns, long enough to understand that decisions were rarely born fully formed. They were assembled, piece by piece, through repetition. Once a phrase was spoken enough times, it hardened. Once a plan was described with sufficient confidence, it became difficult to imagine alternatives without sounding disloyal to the idea of progress itself. There were layers to the hierarchy that went beyond rank or title. Some people spoke because it was their role. Others spoke because no one stopped them. And then there were those whose silence was interpreted as agreement, whose quiet presence served as confirmation rather than absence. I belonged to the last group. My value was measured by how well I fit into the existing shape of things. The rooms where discussions happened were not hostile. They were controlled, calm, almost gentle. The language was precise, stripped of unnecessary emotion. It created the illusion that everything was manageable, that uncertainty could be reduced to variables on a page. When concerns surfaced, they were addressed methodically, framed as obstacles rather than warnings. Obstacles could be planned around. Warnings implied vulnerability. I watched how people navigated this space, how they softened their doubts before presenting them, how they waited for signals, subtle nods, shifts in posture, before continuing, how even those with authority chose their moments carefully, as if aware that too much hesitation could erode the very ground they stood on. Fear didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It lived in the margins, in the brief silences after a question was asked, in the way someone's voice tightened when a possibility was raised that didn't align with the prevailing direction, in the quiet relief when the conversation returned to familiar ground. I understood the cost of misjudging that space. I had seen it before, not as punishment but as absence. People who once occupied the center of discussions slowly drifting outward. Not excluded exactly, just no longer consulted, their presence tolerated, their influence reduced. It was a lesson delivered without cruelty, which made it harder to protest. The chain of command was clear, even when it wasn't spoken. Information flowed upward, decisions flowed down. Somewhere in the middle, interpretation was expected to stop. You could analyze, you could prepare, but you were not meant to redirect. Redirection suggested that the current course was flawed, and flaw was a word no one liked to hear attached to something already in motion. I told myself that my role was to observe, not intervene. That awareness did not automatically grant authority. That responsibility was distributed unevenly by design. If everyone questioned, nothing would move. If everyone hesitated, nothing would happen. These were the quiet justifications that circulated through the corridors, rarely spoken but widely accepted. There was also the unspoken understanding of timing. Even valid concerns could become invalid if raised too late, or too early, or in the wrong setting. A warning delivered at the wrong moment was indistinguishable from sabotage. I had learned to wait for the right time, though no one could ever define when that was. The pressure did not come from threats. It came from expectation, from the assumption that you knew your place and would honor it, from the trust extended to you on the condition that you would not misuse it. Speaking out felt like a betrayal of that trust, even when silence felt like something worse. As the days passed, the atmosphere grew heavier, not with urgency, but with inevitability. Plans were referenced as if they already existed in the world, not merely on paper. Language shifted subtly from possibility to preparation, from discussion to execution. The more often something was described as necessary, the less room there was to question whether it was wise. I noticed how quickly certainty spread, how one confident assertion could quiet an entire room, how doubt, once introduced, needed constant defense to survive, while confidence needed none at all. The imbalance was striking, and it worked in favor of momentum. I remained where I was supposed to be, close enough to understand, far enough to remain silent. I listened. I recorded. I nodded when expected. And each time the structure held, each time the process advanced without interruption, the weight of speaking grew heavier, not because the risk increased, but because the opportunity narrowed. By the time the environment felt fully set, by the time the hierarchy had closed ranks around the direction chosen, it was already clear that any deviation would be seen not as caution, but as resistance. And resistance in that place was something you only recognized in hindsight, usually after it was too late to matter. The argument unfolded entirely inside my head, where it could do no harm except to me. It began quietly, almost politely, as if trying not to draw attention to itself. A simple observation, a small inconsistency, something that didn't align the way it should. I told myself that noticing such things was part of my role, that awareness alone was a kind of responsibility fulfilled. But awareness, when it goes unanswered, has a way of demanding more. I replayed the conversations in fragments, isolating phrases, examining pauses. I wondered whether I was misreading tone, exaggerating significance. Doubt is adaptable like that. It can turn against itself, convincing you that caution is just another word for fear. I asked myself how many times others had seen what I was seeing, and chosen silence without consequence. Perhaps this was simply how things always felt before they worked. There were moments when I almost spoke, not in grand declarations, but in the smallest gestures. A breath drawn at the wrong time, a hand shifting as if to signal attention. Each time I stopped myself with the same reasoning. If it were truly dangerous, someone else would have noticed. Someone with more authority. Someone whose voice carried weight by default. The absence of their concern became evidence against my own. I imagined the room if I did speak. The way heads would turn, not sharply, but slowly. The way the air would thicken, just enough to register disruption. I imagined the question being received not on its merit, but on its origin. Who is he to raise this? What does he know that we don't? The content of the warning felt secondary to the fact of it being spoken by me. Fear has a talent for specificity. It doesn't threaten in abstractions. It presents scenes. I saw myself answering follow-up questions, trying to clarify, watching my words lose precision as they were filtered through expectation. I saw uncertainty attach itself to me like a label I couldn't remove. Once applied, it would follow me quietly, shaping future interactions without ever being named. I told myself that timing mattered, that perhaps this wasn't the moment, that there would be another opportunity, a safer opening, a private conversation where concerns could be raised without spectacle. That was a comforting thought, even though I had no evidence such a moment would come. The idea of a future chance made present silence easier to justify. There was also the temptation to reframe the warning as something less urgent, to convince myself that the risk was theoretical, not immediate, that contingency plans existed, even if I hadn't seen them. That uncertainty was inherent to everything happening around us, and singling out this particular concern might be arbitrary. I diluted the warning until it no longer demanded action, only contemplation. At times, responsibility felt like an unreasonable burden. Why should I be the one to carry it? Why should the cost of disruption fall on me when the system was designed to distribute accountability upward? It felt unfair to expect courage from those who were least protected by structure. The hierarchy offered clarity, but it also offered shelter. Speaking would mean stepping out from under it. I thought about consequences not just for myself, but for the process. What if raising doubt caused delay? What if that delay introduced its own risks? What if my intervention, however well-intentioned, became the variable that made things worse? It was easy to imagine scenarios where silence appeared safer than interference, where doing nothing felt like the least harmful option. The warning began to feel heavier with each cycle of thought, not because it grew more urgent, but because it remained unresolved. It pressed against the boundaries I had built for myself, testing them. Every time I chose not to speak, I felt a brief sense of relief, followed by a deeper unease. The relief was immediate. The unease lingered. I noticed how quickly rationalization followed fear, how neatly I could arrange excuses into something that resembled logic. I told myself that systems correct themselves, that redundancy existed for a reason, that individuals mattered less than the structure as a whole. These ideas had weight behind them. They were not lies, but they were also convenient. There were moments of clarity, brief and sharp, when the warning cut through all of that. In those moments, the risk felt undeniable. I could almost feel the future pressing backward, insisting on being acknowledged. Those moments never lasted. They faded under the steady influence of routine, of normalcy, of the visible calm around me. I began to resent the warning itself. Its persistence felt intrusive, almost accusatory. It demanded courage I wasn't sure I possessed, and it offered no guarantee that courage would matter. I wished irrationally that I had noticed less, that my understanding had been partial, ambiguous, easier to dismiss. The internal debate became exhausting. Speaking required a single moment of resolve. Silence required constant maintenance. I had to choose it again and again, reinforcing it with thought, smoothing over its rough edges. By the time the next opportunity approached, I was already tired, and in that fatigue, the idea of staying quiet began to feel not like a choice, but like the natural continuation of everything that had come before. The moment arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic pause, no sense that time itself had slowed. It came folded inside routine, disguised as just another step forward. Words were spoken with the same measured calm I had grown accustomed to. A conclusion was reached not through debate, but through repetition. What had been discussed became what would be done. I remember the exact sensation of it, a tightening in my chest, subtle but unmistakable. My breath shortened, not enough to draw attention, just enough that I noticed it. My body reacted before my thoughts finished forming, as if it already understood what my mind was still negotiating. The decision was voiced clearly. It did not invite response. It carried the weight of inevitability, framed as necessity rather than choice. Around me there was movement, papers shifting, chairs adjusting, pens finding their place again. The room accepted the direction without resistance, and in doing so, it began to seal itself. This was the moment. I knew it with a certainty that cut through all the justifications I had rehearsed. Not later, not after, now. If the warning were to be given at all, it had to exist in this narrow space before momentum hardened into action. I felt the words rise, fully formed for the first time, no longer searching for safer shapes. They were ready to be spoken plainly. My mouth opened slightly, not enough for sound, enough to feel the strain of stopping. In that fraction of a second, everything I feared condensed into sensation, heat behind my eyes, a faint tremor in my hands, the awareness of my own heartbeat, loud and insistent, as if it were trying to push the words out on its own. I became acutely conscious of the room, of how still it was, how balanced on the assumption that no one would interrupt. I imagined the sound my voice would make breaking that stillness, how it would change the atmosphere instantly, how every face would turn, not in anger but in calculation. I imagined the brief silence that would follow, the one where intent is assessed before response is chosen. That silence felt heavier than anything I had endured before. The thought came unbidden. Once spoken, the warning could not be retrieved. If I was wrong, there would be no quiet correction. If I was right, there would be consequences that stretched far beyond this room. Either way, speaking meant stepping into uncertainty alone. Silence, at least, was shared. I told myself there would be other safeguards, that others would notice what I noticed once action began, that the system was not as fragile as my fear suggested. These thoughts did not convince me, but they delayed me. and delay in that moment was enough. The decision moved forward, carried by voices that did not tremble. A final confirmation was given. It sounded ordinary, procedural, the kind of statement that marks transition from planning to execution, without acknowledging the weight of that shift. I felt my chance closing. The physical act of staying silent was more difficult than I expected. It required tension. My jaw clenched. My tongue pressed flat against the roof of my mouth as if holding something back from escaping. I stared at a fixed point in front of me, afraid that if I looked at anyone directly, they would see the conflict written too clearly on my face. The words receded, not disappearing, but retreating into a place where they could no longer intervene. They settled there heavily, like something buried too shallow to forget. I felt an immediate sense of finality, not relief, not calm, but the unmistakable knowledge that the moment had passed. No one noticed my silence because it matched expectation perfectly. The room shifted seamlessly into the next phase. Tasks were assigned, timelines referenced. The machinery resumed its rhythm. To anyone observing, nothing unusual had occurred. The absence of my voice left no visible trace, but inside me, something had locked into place. I understood with a clarity that made my stomach turn, that the warning I carried now belonged entirely to the future. And whatever happened next, it would happen without the interruption I had just refused to provide. The silence had won, and it had done so quietly, without resistance, exactly as it was designed to. The confirmation came slowly, not as a single moment, but as a series of small realizations that accumulated until denial was no longer possible. At first, everything appeared to be proceeding as expected. Reports arrived on schedule. Language remained controlled, deliberately neutral. Any deviation was framed as adjustment, not error. I listened closely to the phrasing, to the careful avoidance of words that might suggest instability. The structure protected itself through language, absorbing strain without acknowledging it. I felt a constant tension beneath that surface order. Each update carried a familiar weight, a subtle echo of the warning I had not given. I began to hear it in what wasn't said, in the omissions, the shortened explanations, the careful redirection of questions. There was an effort underway, not just to manage events, but to preserve the appearance of coherence. The first clear sign did not arrive as catastrophe. It arrived as delay. A delay explained away as weather, as logistics, as miscommunication. Perfectly reasonable causes, each one plausible on its own. I watched how easily they were accepted. Delays were expected. Delays could be managed. No one treated them as signals. No one connected them to the underlying assumption I had questioned in silence. I did. The pattern began to form in my mind with painful clarity. Each update aligned with the shape I had seen earlier, the trajectory I had tried not to imagine too vividly. I recognized the sequence not because I wanted to, but because I had already lived it in thought. Reality was following the same path, only slower, giving everyone time to adjust emotionally before the truth became unavoidable. I felt an impulse to speak then, to say something now that events were no longer theoretical, but the moment for warning had passed. What remained was explanation, and explanation carries a different weight. To speak now would not be to prevent, but to assign. It would raise questions about why the concern had not surfaced earlier, why silence had seemed acceptable before consequence became visible. I understood suddenly and completely that my silence had an expiration date. It had been tolerated while nothing had gone wrong. Now that things were beginning to strain, it transformed quietly into complicity. Information continued to flow, but it arrived altered, less detailed, more curated. The tone shifted subtly from confidence to control. Not panic, never panic, but a tightening. I could sense the effort required to maintain composure, the way certainty had to be reinforced rather than assumed. There were moments when the truth almost surfaced on its own. A remark cut short, a glance exchanged between people who understood more than they were prepared to say aloud. I watched those moments closely, recognizing the same hesitation I had felt, the same calculation, the same fear of being the first to disrupt the narrative. When the consequences became undeniable, they were described without drama. Loss was quantified, absence noted. The language was restrained as if emotion itself might destabilize what remained intact. I listened to these summaries with a growing sense of dislocation, as though I were hearing a report about something I had already mourned in private. I remembered the certainty I had felt in that earlier moment, the clarity that had cut through every justification. That memory returned now with sharp precision, no longer abstract, no longer hypothetical. It attached itself to each new confirmation, each quiet acknowledgment that something fundamental had gone wrong. There was no confrontation, no reckoning. The system did not pause to examine its own assumptions. It adjusted and moved forward, carrying the cost with it as something already absorbed. That was perhaps the most unsettling realization of all, that the consequences I had feared were survivable, at least for the structure. It did not collapse. It endured. I did not. The weight of knowing settled into my body in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sleep became fragmented, interrupted by the same sequence of thoughts looping without resolution. I found myself replaying the moment of silence repeatedly, searching for a version of it where I spoke, where the outcome bent slightly away from what had happened. I began to notice how easily others adapted to the new reality, how quickly they accepted revised expectations. I did not blame them. They were responding to what was in front of them, not to what might have been. Only I was trapped between those two states, carrying the memory of a future that had once been avoidable. No one accused me. No one needed to. The absence of blame was its own kind of sentence. It left me alone with the knowledge, unchallenged and unshared, a private understanding that had nowhere to go. As time passed, the consequences were folded into history, referenced briefly, then less often, until they became background, something that had happened, something that could not be changed. The machinery continued, adjusted but intact, its momentum uninterrupted, and in that continuation I felt the full cost of my silence, not as punishment imposed from outside, but as a permanent internal reckoning. What I had feared had arrived quietly, just as I had imagined, and I remained where I had always been, close enough to recognize it, powerless to undo it, and fully aware that the moment when it could have been stopped had belonged, briefly, to me. Time did not soften it. It only changed its shape. Years passed, marked by routines that returned, by new environments that carried familiar echoes. Faces changed, roles shifted, the structure endured in altered form, as structures always do. What remained constant was the memory, intact and uncooperative, resurfacing without warning. It did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, embedded in ordinary moments, when there was no effort left to resist it. I would hear a phrase spoken with confidence, and my body would respond before my thoughts caught up. A tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, the same physical reaction, long after the original context had dissolved. The past had trained me to recognize that sensation, and it no longer required explanation. It was simply there. I tried at times to frame the memory differently, to tell myself that one voice rarely alters the course of large events, that systems are designed to move forward regardless of individual hesitation. These thoughts had logic behind them. They were not untrue, but they failed to touch the core of what remained unresolved, because the memory was not about outcome. It was about the moment itself. I remembered it with unsettling clarity, the way the room had felt balanced, fragile in its certainty, the way the words had existed fully formed, waiting, the precise instant when I had chosen not to disturb that balance. That memory did not fade with repetition. If anything, it sharpened. Each return to it stripped away another layer of excuse, another attempt at reinterpretation. I began to understand that silence leaves no evidence. There is no record of the words not spoken, no trace of the warning that never entered the room. History does not account for restraint. It only measures action. That absence made the guilt difficult to articulate, even to myself. There was nothing tangible to point to, no mark that said this is where you failed, and yet I knew. The guilt did not manifest as constant anguish. It was more insidious than that. It appeared as a quiet recalibration of how I saw myself, a subtle erosion of certainty. I hesitated more, not because I had learned caution, but because I no longer trusted my instincts without reservation. I had once recognized danger clearly and still chosen silence. That knowledge altered how much faith I could place in my own judgment. There were nights when I replayed alternate versions of the past, not as fantasies of heroism, but as simple divergences. A sentence spoken calmly, a question asked without accusation, a pause introduced at the right moment. In these imagined versions, the outcome was not always better. Sometimes it was worse, but the silence was gone. That absence alone felt significant. What lingered was not the fear I had felt then, but the understanding of it. I recognized it now as something familiar, something I had allowed to govern me, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was reasonable. That realization was harder to accept than the fear itself. It meant the choice had been mine, made deliberately, with full awareness. I did not seek forgiveness. There was no one to ask. The event had been absorbed into the past, its edges smoothed by time and distance. Others remembered it differently, or not at all. For them, it was one chapter among many. For me, it remained a fixed point, unaltered by context. I carried it forward quietly. In new situations, when uncertainty surfaced, I felt the old tension return. Sometimes I spoke, sometimes I didn't. Each decision was heavier than it should have been, weighed down by memory. Silence no longer felt neutral. It carried history with it. There was no moment of resolution, no insight that transformed the guilt into purpose. It remained unresolved, persistent, resistant to closure. I learned to live alongside it, not because it diminished, but because it had nowhere else to go. What stayed with me most was the knowledge that the warning had been real, that it had existed fully and clearly, and that I had held it intact until the moment passed. That knowledge did not accuse me. It did not need to. It simply remained. And in its persistence, I understood that some consequences do not announce themselves through loss or destruction, but through memory, unchanged, unshared, and permanently aware of the moment when silence felt easier than speaking and became something I would carry for the rest of my life.